Hello everyone. Okay, this is the first video on conservatism, our third key or ideology. And this first video I'm going to do today, I'm just going to do a quick overview of conservatism. Then the second video, which I'll probably record straight afterwards, we'll have a look at conservatism and human nature. So, I think the first thing to understand about conservatism is that it's traditionally sought to conserve society, and they tend to be very distrustful about ideological thinking and people who want to create like a utopia, like reform society from scratch or make some really big radical changes. They're very distrustful of that type of thinking. Um, as I just said, they wish to conserve society. However, there's a very common misunderstanding of conservatism, and that misunderstanding is that conservatives don't believe in change, which actually is not true. Conservatism actually is about change, and they believe that change is inevitable. But what they argue is that any change has to be done in a very considered way. It has to be done as a way of conserving what has been good in the past, so trying to keep what is good and try and maintain what is good, and that any change should occur in a very kind of manageable manner. Edmund Burke, often seen as the father of conservatism, one of our traditional conservative key thinkers, he said, quote, "A state without the means of change is without the means of its conservation," unquote. So change is part of conservatism. However, it's a very kind of limited change, well thought through change, and as a way of trying to conserve what is already good about society or whatever it is which you wish to change. Another key theme of conservatism is their views of human nature. They tend to see humans as being imperfect, humans being flawed, whether that be intellectually or psychologically. And again, this is something we'll come on to in much more detail in the next video. Now, in terms of the exam, we have three strands of conservatism which we need to examine and compare and contrast with each other. The first one is traditional conservatism, and for this we have our two key thinkers on this. One is Thomas Hobbes, who was writing around the 1650s, so just following and during the English Civil War. And we have Edmund Burke, who I've mentioned before is really seen as the father of conservatism. He was writing in about the 1780s, 1790s, that kind of period, and a lot of his writing was kind of reaction against the French Revolution, arguing that, because some liberals like Mary Wollstonecraft, for example, were arguing for a similar revolution in Britain. He was very much saying, no, this will be terrible. We should preserve what is good about Britain and England. And so he was writing in reaction, I suppose, to the French Revolution. We then have one nation conservatism, which in many ways is quite similar to traditional conservatism. And you'll probably find in most essays there's often quite a lot of agreement between traditional and one nation conservatives. They were reacting to a different kind of revolution, the Industrial Revolution, those big economic changes that took place in that Victorian period, which brought about lots of wealth but also lots of poverty. Unfortunately, he's not one of our key thinkers, but Benjamin Disraeli, who was Prime Minister from about the 1860s, that kind of period, he's often associated with these ideas of one nation conservatism. He was really concerned that unless there were some changes that were made to Britain, unless there were some economic reforms that were made or some laws passed to benefit those from the lower orders, then there would then be some kind of catastrophic revolution. So again, he's making changes to conserve. He's to conserve Britain and our traditions and customs by making some changes. Our key thinker on one nation conservatism, though, is not Benjamin Disraeli, it's Michael Oakeshott, who was writing, I think it was about the 1950s, if memory serves me right. And again, very similar ideas to Disraeli, and this idea of Britain in the 1950s where the Conservatives really kind of embraced one nation conservatism. Again, it's this appeal to the disadvantaged for conservatism. And then the third strand, which some might say are not really conservatives in many ways, but anyway, are the so-called new rights. These developed as a consequence of the 1960s, the social liberation, and the 1970s. And our two key thinkers on this, because basically the new right is divided into two. You've got the neoliberals and the neoconservatives. Now, the neoliberals are where our two key thinkers are located. So we've got Ayn Rand, who was writing for the United States in the late 1970s, that kind of period. Just a bit about her background. Her family had fled the Russian Revolution of 1917. So again, I suppose a little bit of reaction against those events. And also you've got Nozick as well. So Rand and Nozick, they're very much on the new right, but from the liberal wing of the new right. And they've got very different ideas to the other conservatives about things like the state and human nature, etc., etc. And then we've also then got the neoconservatives, who we don't have a key thinker for. In many ways, these have got a bit more in common with the other conservatives, and they were very concerned about things like public morality, law and order, and again, this idea that people are imperfect, and therefore we need kind of strong law and order to ensure that our morals are kind of in place. So yeah, and then if you look at some politicians who claim that they knew right, people like Margaret Thatcher, for example, economically they're very often neoliberals, but then socially they're very much on that neoconservative wing. When we look at American politics next year, again we'll see quite a few of their politicians who fit into one or two of these kind of new right strands. But anyway, that's just an introduction into conservatism. There are three main strands: traditional, one nation, and new right. And our five key thinkers: Hobbes, Burke, Oakeshott, Rand, and Nozick. So the next video I'll make in a couple of minutes, we'll have a look at conservatism and human nature.